Matt, look, first of all, let's just state the obvious, which is saving lives is the single most important thing. But storm response is a major test for government, period. In the final month before a presidential campaign, what are the potential stakes here, politically as well as for lives and property?
Well, to reemphasize your first point, my heart goes out to all the people there. I'm a 90-year-old father who lives in Sarasota, so he's deciding what he's going to do in the course of this. So you're right that that's the most important, the health and safety of all those people there. These are one of those things where it's hard to really guess what the political dynamic of this be, because it all depends, I think, on the response. The response to Helene, no matter what the internet rumors and lies have been, has been fairly good. The people have suffered, but the response by the federal government has been fairly good. We saw a good response in 2012 to Hurricane Sandy, actually helped Barack Obama in his reelect. We saw the same thing in 2004. There were 3 hurricanes, I think, in the time leading up, and when George W. Bush, who I worked for, was running, there was 3 hurricanes, I think 3 or 4, leading up to that race, presidential election. He handled them well, and I think it helped him in the course of that, showing the federal government. But we know what happened with Hurricane Katrina. That was a horrible incidence of government mismanagement, and it hurt George W. Bush, even though he no longer faced a re-election in the course of this. And so I think it depends a lot on the federal government response, which so far I think has been very good. The other part that I don't think we can underemphasize is that this raises the stakes of climate change as an issue. And that will impact and have an effect on voters, not just in Florida, but throughout the United States, because there are people that worry about it, but don't place it as a top 5 issue. But as these hurricanes intensify, as the problems become worse and worse because of climate change, the resonance of climate change as an issue could rise in the course of the next 30 days. And that, I think, could be a dynamic that affects a lot of different states.
So, Antonia, all of this, as Matt rightfully points out, on the heels of Helene, and Republican lawmakers in North Carolina have been echoing FEMA's calls for an end to the disinformation about disaster relief. What does that disinformation look like? What can you tell us from there on the ground?
Chris, I think it's important to put this into sort of 2 categories. The first is that here on the ground, and I'm in Burnsville, a small rural community that's about 40, 60 minutes away from Asheville. And there are people who are rightfully frustrated, of course, heartbroken over all that they've lost, and they want to see more support here. They believe that there should be more FEMA representatives available to them. They'd like to see a better federal response, and they're not engaging in conspiracy theory. They're just concerned about their own community. And then there are people spreading willful misinformation. A few examples. One is that FEMA is capping their aid to families at $750, that if you accept that aid, you're actually entering into a secret loan and you'll be forced to pay it back. None of that is true. $750 may be something they initially give you to help you get medication or some emergency supplies, but then through application processes, you can get all kinds of other funds for your home or other losses. And it's not a loan. They can't come back and ask you for that money later. Some people believe that they're seizing people's land. FEMA is not capable of doing that. And so I think there is, of course, the pain and confusion that those rumors cause, and that keeps people from seeking help that they very much need. But then there is a need to recognize that some people, we're 10, 11 days into this. They are saying, hey, FEMA, please come to the hills in Burnsville. We would like to see you here. And I think it's important to make that differentiation and have empathy and understanding for people who, right now they're sharing supplies, they're cooking meals for each other. It's about to get cold here. People are going to need more than just water bottles, Chris. They're going to need blankets. They're going to need winter coats. They lost literally everything in many cases. And so there's that level of need here. And so, while the federal government is making their way through all these communities, I think people deserve to have their voices and concerns heard, too.
Antonia, thank you for that. So Matt, look, disinformation is very real. And you put it in the vacuum of what we're seeing there, which is, first of all, people are occupied with other things besides trying to track down what is and isn't true. But then you have the second part of it, which is lack of communication, right? Some people lost communication they have. There's still not everybody has it back. Anyway, I want to play some of what Donald Trump has been saying about Helene.
They stole the FEMA money just like they stole it from a bank so they could give it to their illegal immigrants that they want to have vote for them this season. This is the worst response in the history of hurricanes.
How does that play? How does that play in a very real sense? And how does that play in a political sense?
Well, first of all, it is just the lies that come out of Donald Trump's mouth on a daily basis is as much as you and I breathe in the course of this. So, but there's a problem is that there's 40% of the country that seems to think that listens to him and seems to think he tells the truth on many things. Here's the problem with this misinformation. And as Antonio relayed, this is the problem, is a functional democracy depends on the ability to get to the common good through a common set of facts. And our health systems depend on it, as we saw during COVID. And our natural response, FEMA depends on it when we're responding in government response to it. So the functioning of government depends on the ability for us to share a common set of facts and then to deal with it and act accordingly. When we have these conspiracies and all of this playing, and not only does it have a political effect, and it affects sort of people's perceptions of politicians in a right or wrong way in the course of this. And Donald Trump is playing on those fears through telling those lies. But it actually really, on a real way, affects the functionality of government in responding to this. Because if people believe a conspiracy theory and believe if they take money, somehow their land is going to be taken or they're going to have to owe it back, then they make decisions that actually could hurt themselves or hurt their neighborhoods and hurt their communities. The same exact thing we saw when the spread of misinformation happened during COVID and health crisis is people made decisions based on bad information, and actually many people in many communities were hurt by it. And so that, to me, is while, yes, there is a political effect, and yes, it broadly affects our democracy and people's ability to get to a common set of facts, more importantly and poignantly, it affects our actual ability to respond as a government to crises we have.
Matt Dowd, first of all, love to your dad.
Thank you.
We're going to keep our fingers crossed for him.